There are stories history remembers, and then there are the ones it was told to forget. In the ancient world, there stood a city so powerful, so wealthy, so feared, that it rivaled Rome itself. A maritime empire that controlled the Mediterranean's trade routes, commanded vast armies, and produced military geniuses who nearly brought the Roman Republic to its knees. Its name was Carthage. And yet, when you walk through the ruins today in modern-day Tunisia, you find only whispers of what once was. Fragments, silence, the deliberate erasure of a civilization. This is not a story about defeat. This is a story about annihilation, about how one empire systematically destroyed another, then rewrote history to justify it, about how Rome didn't just want to conquer Carthage, they wanted to unmake it, to salt its earth, to burn its libraries, to ensure that future generations would only know Carthage through Roman eyes, through Roman words, through Roman hatred. For over a century, Carthage and Rome were locked in a death struggle. 3 wars, 3 Punic Wars. The first was about control, the second was about survival, but the third was about something far darker. It was about making sure Carthage would never rise again, that its language would die, its culture would fade, its very existence would become a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of Roman triumph. The Carthaginians called their city Carthage, the New City. Founded by Phoenician settlers from the ancient city of Tyre around 814 BCE, it grew from a trading post into an empire. While Rome was still a collection of hills and villages, Carthage was already a thriving metropolis. Its double harbor could shelter over 200 warships. Its walls stood 90 feet high, in places 40 feet thick. Inside those walls lived over 400,000 people, artisans, merchants, sailors, priests, and warriors. The city glittered with temples dedicated to Baal Hammon and Tanit, their gods of fertility and war. The streets buzzed with languages from across the Mediterranean: Punic, Greek, Numidian, Iberian, gold from West Africa, silver from Iberian mines, tin from distant Britain. All of it flowed through Carthage's markets. But it was not just wealth that made Carthage formidable, it was a vision. While other civilizations clung to their lands, Carthage looked outward. They established colonies across the western Mediterranean in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, and southern Iberia. They developed advanced shipbuilding techniques, creating quinqueremes and triremes that dominated the seas. Their navy was unmatched. Their merchant fleet connected 3 continents. They were the masters of maritime power in an age when controlling the sea meant controlling the world. And Rome noticed. At first, the 2 powers coexisted. Treaties divided spheres of influence. Rome focused on consolidating Italy. Carthage expanded its commercial empire. But empires, like wolves, cannot share the same hunting ground forever. The collision came in 264 BCE over the island of Sicily. It seemed like a small dispute, a local conflict involving mercenaries in the city of Messana. But it ignited something that would burn for over a century. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. It was fought primarily at sea, a domain where Carthage held every advantage, yet Rome, stubborn and resourceful, built a navy from scratch. They copied a captured Carthaginian warship, adding their own innovation, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into infantry combat. Where Carthage had elegance and experience, Rome had raw determination and endless manpower. The war bled both sides white. Hundreds of ships sank. Tens of thousands died. But in the end, Rome's relentless grinding attrition won. Carthage sued for peace, surrendering Sicily and paying a massive indemnity. For Carthage, it was a humiliation, but not a death sentence. The city still had its African territories, its Iberian colonies, its trade networks. The Barca family, especially the general Hamilcar Barca, refused to accept defeat. Hamilcar took his young son to the temple and made him swear an oath of eternal hatred against Rome. That boy's name was Hannibal. While Rome celebrated its victory and counted its new territories, Carthage rebuilt in the shadows. Hamilcar, and later his son-in-law Hasdrubal, carved out a new empire in Iberia, rich with silver mines and fierce Iberian warriors. They created armies loyal not to Carthage's merchant senate, but to the Barca family. They prepared, they planned. And when Hamilcar died and Hasdrubal was assassinated, command fell to Hannibal. He was 26 years old, and he would make Rome remember that oath sworn in childhood. In 218 BCE, Hannibal launched one of history's most audacious military campaigns. Rather than meet Rome at sea where their rebuilt navy might face defeat, he chose the impossible. He marched his army infantry, cavalry, and war elephants overland from Iberia, across southern Gaul, over the Alps in winter, and into the heart of Italy. When Roman scouts reported African war elephants descending from snow-covered mountain passes, they thought they were seeing ghosts. But Hannibal was no ghost. He was a tactical genius. At the Trebia River, he lured the Romans into an ambush. At Lake Trasimene, he annihilated an entire Roman army in the fog. And at Cannae, in 216 BCE, he orchestrated what military historians still study as the perfect battle. Facing a Roman force of over 80,000 men, Hannibal used a double envelopment. His center retreated deliberately while his cavalry smashed the Roman flanks and closed the trap. 50,000 Romans died that day. It remains one of the bloodiest single-day battles in ancient history. Hannibal stood at the gates of Rome itself. Italy's allies began to defect. Entire regions rose in rebellion. Capua, Rome's second-largest city, opened its gates to the Carthaginian army. For a moment it seemed the Roman Republic might shatter. But Rome had something Carthage did, not an inexhaustible reserve of Italian manpower and an absolute refusal to surrender. They raised new legions, they promoted new generals, they learned from their defeats. And slowly, methodically, they began to turn the tide. The Roman general who changed everything was not a warrior in the traditional sense. Publius Cornelius Scipio was young, barely in his 30s, but he understood something fundamental about Hannibal's position. The Carthaginian was a foreign invader, isolated in hostile territory, dependent on reinforcements and supplies that never came. The Roman Senate, traumatized by Cannae, refused to face Hannibal in direct battle. Instead, they adopted the Fabian strategy, named after the general Fabius Maximus, avoiding major engagements while harassing supply lines and isolating Hannibal's forces. But Scipio saw a more aggressive solution. If Hannibal would not leave Italy, Rome would give him a reason to. Scipio proposed attacking Carthage itself, forcing them to recall their greatest general to defend their homeland. It was bold, reckless, some said, but Rome's desperation made room for such audacity. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed in North Africa with a Roman army. He immediately began cutting Carthage's African alliances, winning over Numidian kingdoms that had previously supported Carthaginian dominance. The most crucial was Massinissa, a Numidian prince whose cavalry would prove instrumental. Carthage panicked. Their homeland, untouched by war for generations, suddenly faced Roman legions at their doorstep. The call went out. Hannibal must return. For 15 years, Hannibal had campaigned in Italy. 15 years of brilliant victories and strategic stalemate. He had never been defeated in a major battle. But he had also never been able to deliver the final blow to Rome. Now Rome was bringing the war to him. In 202 BCE, Hannibal sailed home, not as a conquering hero, but as Carthage's last hope. The two armies met at Zama, southwest of Carthage. It was a confrontation 17 years in the making. The greatest Carthaginian general versus the Roman who had studied his every tactic. Hannibal deployed his war elephants first, hoping to break the Roman lines as he had done so many times before, but Scipio had learned. He created corridors in his formation, allowing the elephants to charge through harmlessly while Roman skirmishers attacked them from the sides. The beasts, maddened by wounds and trumpet blasts, turned back into Carthaginian lines, causing chaos. Then came the cavalry battle. Massinissa's Numidian horsemen, once Carthage's most reliable allies, now fought for Rome. They swept away Hannibal's cavalry wings and disappeared in pursuit. What remained was an infantry slugfest, Roman legionaries against Carthaginian veterans. Hannibal's center was composed of soldiers who had fought with him in Italy, hard men who knew Roman tactics intimately. They pushed forward. The battle hung in brutal balance. Then Massinissa's cavalry returned, smashing into the Carthaginian rear just as Hannibal had done to the Romans at Cannae. The envelopment was complete. The irony was not lost on anyone. Hannibal, the master of the double envelopment, defeated by his own signature tactic. Thousands of Carthaginians died. Hannibal escaped with a fraction of his army. For the second time, Carthage sued for peace. But this time, the terms were devastating. They would surrender all their warships except 10 ceremonial vessels. They would pay 10,000 talents over 50 years, a sum designed to cripple their economy. They would never make war without Roman permission, their empire, their navy, their independence all stripped away. Carthage accepted because the alternative was annihilation, or so they thought. In the decades that followed, something unexpected happened. Carthage began to recover. Stripped of military power, the city turned entirely to commerce. Without the expense of maintaining armies and fleets, their economy flourished. Their merchants dominated trade routes that even Roman incompetence couldn't manage as efficiently. Within a generation, Carthage was wealthy again. Not powerful in military terms, but rich, dangerously rich. In Rome, a senator named Marcus Porcius Cato watched this recovery with growing alarm. Cato the Elder, as history would call him, became obsessed with Carthage. Every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of topic, ended with the same phrase: Delenda est Carthago, Carthage must be destroyed. He brought fresh Carthaginian figs to the Senate, demonstrating how close and how fertile their African rival remained, how quickly they could rebuild, how they could never truly be trusted. Cato was not alone in his paranoia. A faction in Rome believed that peace with Carthage was impossible, that as long as the city existed, it would be a threat, that Rome's security required not just Carthage's subjugation, but its obliteration. They needed only a pretext. That pretext came from Numidia. Massinissa, Rome's old ally, had been steadily encroaching on Carthaginian territory for decades. Every time Carthage complained to Rome, the Senate sided with Numidia. Carthaginian lands were seized. Their protests were ignored. Finally, in 151 BCE, Carthage had enough. They raised an army to defend themselves against Numidian incursions. It was a defensive action, a matter of basic sovereignty. But under the terms of the treaty ending the Second Punic War, Carthage was forbidden from making war without Roman permission. Rome declared this a violation. They demanded reparations. When Carthage paid, Rome demanded more. They demanded that Carthage hand over 300 noble children as hostages. Carthage complied, sending their sons and daughters to Roman custody. Then, Rome issued its final demand. The Carthaginians must abandon their city and relocate at least 10 miles inland, away from the sea. For a maritime civilization, this was a death sentence. Their identity, their economy, their entire existence was built on access to the Mediterranean. Moving inland meant ceasing to be Carthage in any meaningful sense. It was cultural annihilation, dressed as diplomacy. The Carthaginian Senate sent ambassadors to plead. They offered everything: wealth, territory, complete submission. But Rome's answer was clear: abandon the city or be destroyed. Carthage chose defiance. In 149 BCE, when the Roman ultimatum became known, the city erupted in desperate fury. They killed the Roman ambassadors. They freed slaves and armed them. They melted down temple ornaments and citizen jewelry to forge weapons. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings for new bows. They appointed Hasdrubal, a grandson of Massinissa, as military commander despite his lack of experience. Because what Carthage needed was not tactical genius, they needed a symbol of resistance. The Third Punic War was not a war in the traditional sense, it was a siege, an execution. Rome sent both consuls with massive armies to besiege a city that had already disarmed, that had already paid tribute, that had already surrendered its hostages. The hypocrisy was staggering. But Rome no longer cared about appearances. They wanted Carthage erased. The siege began in 149 BCE. Roman forces surrounded the city by land, while their fleet blockaded the harbors. They expected a quick collapse. Instead, they encountered ferocious resistance. The Carthaginians had transformed their city into a fortress. Every building became a defensive position. Civilians fought alongside soldiers. Old men and children hauled stones to repair walls. The city that Rome thought disarmed was forging new weapons in makeshift workshops, producing over 100 shields and 300 swords daily. They even built new warships in secret, using stored timber and hidden materials. The Roman commanders were incompetent, their soldiers ill-prepared for urban warfare against a desperate population. The first 2 years of the siege accomplished nothing. Roman armies suffered from disease, poor logistics, and low morale. Carthaginian raids harassed their camps, supply convoys were ambushed. The siege dragged on, embarrassing Rome before the entire Mediterranean world. Then in 147 BCE, Rome sent a new commander. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal at Zama. The younger Scipio was only 37, but already recognized as Rome's most capable general. He arrived and immediately reorganized the siege. He rebuilt discipline. He tightened the blockade. He constructed siege works that completely isolated Carthage from any hope of relief. Scipio studied the city's defenses methodically. Carthage's triple walls were still formidable, but the city was starving. He cut off all supply routes. He built a mole across the harbor entrance, sealing even maritime access. Inside the city, people began eating leather, then rats, then each other. Disease spread through the crowded streets. Children died in their mothers' arms. Still, Hasdrubal refused to surrender. In the spring of 146 BCE, Scipio launched his final assault. Roman soldiers poured over the walls at the weakest points, near the harbors where starvation had thinned the defenders. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Romans fought from house to house, building to building. Carthaginians made them pay for every street. Women threw tiles from rooftops. Old men wielded kitchen knives. The city became an inferno as Romans set fire to buildings to smoke out defenders. For 6 days and 6 nights, the fighting raged. The streets ran with blood. Smoke choked the sky. The Roman soldiers, hardened veterans of countless campaigns, were shocked by the ferocity of resistance. This was not an army they were fighting, it was an entire people refusing to die quietly. Hasdrubal and the last defenders retreated to the Temple of Eshmun on Byrsa Hill, the highest point of the city. 50,000 civilians crowded inside, hoping the sacred ground might grant them mercy. Hasdrubal knew better. When Scipio's forces surrounded the temple, the Carthaginian commander made his choice. He descended alone, fell to his knees before Scipio, and begged for his life. Scipio granted it, but Hasdrubal's wife, watching from the temple walls with their children, did not forgive his cowardice. Ancient sources record her final words, shouted across the flames, "Wretch, traitor! This fire will be my tomb and that of my children. But for you, the Roman general will reserve you for his triumph, to parade you as a spectacle through Roman streets." Then she slit her children's throats, threw their bodies into the burning temple, and walked into the flames herself. The temple of Eshmun collapsed, the civilians inside perished, Carthage fell. But Rome was not finished. Scipio ordered the city leveled, systematically, completely. Roman soldiers demolished buildings, pulled down walls and smashed monuments. They destroyed the harbors, filled in the docks, and broke the aqueducts. They wanted no stone left standing. Over 17 days, they worked to unmake a city that had stood for 7 centuries. Then came the libraries. Carthage had possessed one of the ancient world's great repositories of knowledge, texts on navigation, agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, history, and literature written in Punic and translated from Phoenician, Egyptian, and Greek sources. Works that recorded African history from perspectives Romans never cared to preserve. Scientific treatises, religious texts, poetry, 700 years of accumulated wisdom. The Romans burned it all. Only one Carthaginian work survived because Romans found it useful, a 28-volume agricultural treatise by Mago, which they translated into Latin before destroying the original. Everything else was ash. Entire bodies of literature, philosophy, and science vanished. We know Carthaginian authors existed only because later Greek and Roman writers mentioned them, but their words are lost forever. The Punic language itself, once spoken across the Mediterranean, survived only in fragments, inscriptions, and a handful of phrases quoted by Roman authors mocking its sound. Then came the final ritual. According to later Roman historians, Scipio plowed the ruins and sowed them with salt, cursing the ground so nothing would grow there again. Modern historians debate whether this actually happened or if it was symbolic mythology added later. But the intention was real. Carthage must not rise again. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery, families torn apart on auction blocks, children separated from their parents, a population scattered across the Mediterranean as property. The city that had produced Hannibal, that had challenged Rome for supremacy, that had nearly changed the course of Western civilization, reduced to slaves and ghosts. Rome annexed the territory as the province of Africa. They built Roman cities on Carthaginian ruins, Roman roads over Carthaginian streets. They colonized the land with Roman veterans, planted Roman crops, imposed Roman law. Within generations, the memory of Carthage as a living civilization faded. But why? Why this totality of destruction? Rome had defeated many enemies, the Samnites, the Gauls, the Greeks, the Macedonians. Yet, none suffered Carthage's fate. None were erased so completely. What made Carthage different? The answer lies in fear. And in guilt? Carthage represented something Rome could not tolerate, an alternative model of Mediterranean power. Where Rome expanded through military conquest and direct territorial control, Carthage built a commercial empire through trade networks and client relationships. Where Rome was a land power learning to use the sea, Carthage was a maritime civilization that happened to also field armies. Where Rome valued martial tradition and agrarian virtue, Carthage celebrated merchant wealth and cultural cosmopolitanism. For over a century, these two visions of empire collided, and Rome nearly lost. Hannibal's campaign in Italy traumatized the Roman psyche in ways modern readers struggle to comprehend. For 15 years, a foreign army ravaged the Italian countryside. For 15 years, Rome's military dominance was questioned. For 15 years, their allies defected and their citizens doubted. Cannae became a byword for catastrophe. Entire generations grew up with stories of Hannibal as the boogeyman. Even after Zama, even after the Second Punic War ended, that fear never left. Cato the Elder's obsessive "Carthage must be destroyed" was not just political rhetoric, it expressed a deep cultural anxiety. As long as Carthage existed, Rome could not feel secure. As long as those walls stood, those harbors functioned, that rival civilization breathed, Rome remained the city that almost fell. So they made sure it could never threaten them again, not militarily, not economically, not even as a memory. But there was also guilt. Rome had provoked the Third Punic War through a series of escalating, unreasonable demands designed to be rejected. They had backed Carthage into a corner, forced them to choose between submission or destruction, then destroyed them for choosing defiance. Even some Roman contemporaries recognized the injustice. The historian Polybius, who witnessed the fall of Carthage firsthand as part of Scipio's staff, recorded that Scipio wept as the city burned. When asked why, Scipio reportedly quoted Homer, saying he feared that one day Rome would suffer the same fate. It was a moment of clarity. Scipio understood that Rome had crossed a line. That the destruction of Carthage was not just a military victory but something darker, an act of imperial terrorism designed to send a message to the entire Mediterranean world. Resist Rome completely, and you will not just be defeated, you will be erased. The message was received. After Carthage, resistance to Rome became rare. When the Greeks of Corinth rebelled that same year, 146 BCE, Rome destroyed that city too, leveling it as thoroughly as Carthage. The pattern was established: total submission or total destruction. For the next several centuries, few dared challenge Roman power directly. But Rome's victory came at a cost to the truth. Because Carthage was destroyed so completely, because its libraries were burned, because its people were silenced, everything we know about Carthage comes from Roman sources. And Rome was not an impartial narrator. Roman historians portrayed Carthaginians as cruel, duplicitous, morally degenerate. They accused them of child sacrifice to Baal Hammon, citing the Tophet, a burial ground for infant remains. Modern archaeology suggests these were more likely infant mortality burials, common in ancient high infant mortality societies. But Roman propaganda used them to justify annihilation. "Look at these monsters," Rome said. "Look at what we saved the world from." Roman accounts portrayed Hannibal as a brilliant but barbaric adversary, a worthy enemy, precisely because defeating him made Rome look stronger. But they also systematically minimized Carthaginian achievements. Carthaginian ships became pirate vessels in Roman texts. Carthaginian commerce became greed. Carthaginian religion became savage superstition. Carthaginian military success became luck or Roman failure. Never Carthaginian excellence. We have no Carthaginian histories written by Carthaginians, no Punic epics, no memoirs of their generals, no philosophical treatises, no records of how they saw themselves. The Carthaginian voice is silent, and Rome's voice fills that silence with its own narrative. This is what erasure looks like. Not just destroying a city, but destroying the ability of future generations to understand it on its own terms, making sure that history remembers only the conqueror's story. Yet even Roman sources, hostile as they are, cannot completely hide Carthaginian greatness. They cannot erase Hannibal's genius. Roman military academies still study his tactics. They cannot deny Carthaginian navigational and shipbuilding mastery. Roman fleets were built on copied Carthaginian designs. They cannot ignore the wealth and sophistication that made Carthage Rome's most dangerous rival for over a century. In 44 BCE, exactly 100 years after Carthage fell, Julius Caesar proposed rebuilding the city as a Roman colony. His vision was realized by Augustus. A new city rose on the ruins, eventually becoming one of the most important Roman centers in Africa. By the 2nd century CE, Carthage was again one of the empire's largest cities, home to Roman administrators, Christian theologians, and North African scholars. But this was a Roman Carthage, built on the bones of the Punic original. The language was Latin. The gods were Roman. The culture was imported. Some continuity survived. Punic was still spoken in rural areas into the 5th century CE. St. Augustine, the Christian theologian from nearby Hippo, noted that Punic remained common in North African countryside centuries after Rome destroyed the city. Punic religious practices blended into Roman cults. Carthaginian agricultural techniques, preserved in that translated text by Mago, influenced Roman farming across the empire. Genetic and cultural threads persisted despite Rome's efforts. But the Carthaginian civilization, as an independent entity, as a distinct voice in human history, was extinguished in 146 BCE. The fall of Carthage reverberates through history in ways both obvious and subtle. It established a precedent for total war, for victory that demanded not just military defeat, but cultural annihilation. It demonstrated that empires could be erased deliberately, systematically, with full awareness of what was being destroyed. Rome knew what they were doing. Scipio's tears were not ignorance, but recognition. This strategy of erasure would be repeated throughout history. The Mongols would do it to Baghdad. The Spanish would do it to indigenous American civilizations. Colonial powers would do it to countless African cultures. The pattern Rome perfected at Carthage: destroy the infrastructure, burn the libraries, silence the language, sell the survivors, rewrite the history, became a template for imperial dominance. But the story of Carthage also reveals the limits of erasure. Even without their own written records, even through hostile sources, the Carthaginians remain present. We know they were formidable because Rome had to try so hard to destroy them. We know they were sophisticated because Rome copied their technology. We know they were feared because Rome's greatest orators obsessed over their destruction decades after they ceased to be a military threat. The archaeological record tells stories Roman texts tried to hide. The Tophet remains controversial, but modern excavations have also revealed the stunning scale of Carthage's harbour facilities. The circular military harbour alone could shelter 220 ships, with two-story arsenals and covered shipyards that represented engineering marvels of the ancient world. The city's water system, with its massive cisterns and aqueducts, supplied fountains throughout the city, even during sieges. The residential areas show sophisticated urban planning. The artifacts, Phoenician inscriptions, Egyptian amulets, Greek pottery, Iberian metalwork demonstrate a cosmopolitan culture that bridged civilizations. Recent scholarship has worked to reconstruct Carthaginian history from archaeology, comparative linguistics, and careful reading against the grain of Roman sources. We now understand that Carthage was not merely Rome's enemy, but a complex civilization with its own achievements, values, and historical trajectory. A culture that synthesized Phoenician maritime traditions with African resources and Hellenistic innovations. A society that created constitutional government with elected suffetes, magistrates, and a powerful senate, balancing aristocratic and commercial interests in ways that influenced later political thought. Hannibal himself was not just a military genius, but a multilingual intellectual. Ancient sources note he spoke Punic, Greek, and learned Latin. After Zama, he became suffeter of Carthage, implementing political and economic reforms that accelerated the city's recovery, reforms so effective they contributed to Roman fears. When Rome demanded his extradition years later, he fled to the Seleucid Empire, then to Bithynia, serving various Hellenistic kingdoms as a military advisor until Roman pressure followed him everywhere. In 183 BCE, surrounded by Roman agents and betrayed by his host, Hannibal took poison rather than be captured. "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced," he reportedly said, "since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Even in death, Hannibal defied Rome. His final act was denying them the spectacle of his capture, the triumph they craved. He remains one of history's most studied generals, his campaigns analyzed in military academies worldwide. Every officer who learns about Cannae, every strategist who studies double envelopment, every tactician who appreciates battlefield innovation, they all learn from a Carthaginian who refused to be erased. The same can be said of Carthage itself. Every time historians examine ancient Mediterranean trade networks, Carthaginian merchant routes appear. Every time archaeologists excavate Phoenician colonial sites, they find Carthaginian influence. Every time linguists trace the etymology of words related to navigation, commerce, and shipbuilding, Punic roots emerge. The civilization lives in fragments, in echoes, in the negative space of Roman sources. And perhaps most importantly, the destruction of Carthage forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about historical narrative itself. Whose stories survive? Who gets to write history? What do we lose when victors control the record? The silence of Carthaginian voices is not natural, it was created, deliberately, by people who understood that destroying a civilization required destroying its ability to speak to the future. This is why Carthage matters today. Not just as ancient history, but as a reminder that erasure is always a choice. That history is not what happened, but what we remember about what happened. That forgetting is often enforced, not accidental. And that recovering lost histories even partially, even imperfectly, is an act of resistance against that erasure. For people whose own histories have been silenced, marginalized, or deliberately destroyed, Carthage is a mirror. It shows how empires justify erasure, how they call it civilization, how they make their violence seem inevitable, even righteous. But it also shows that total erasure is impossible. That resistance creates echoes. That even a civilization reduced to ash and slavery leaves traces for those willing to look. The ruins at Carthage today are not empty. The site is an archaeological park, a UNESCO World Heritage location where tourists walk among fragments of both Punic and Roman civilizations. The ancient harbors are visible, their circular shapes still discernible. The Tophet remains, its standing stones enigmatic and debated. The Roman theatre, the Antonine baths, the aqueduct all built atop the earlier city, and beneath them, in layers, the Punic foundations persist. Tunisia has reclaimed Carthage as part of its heritage, not as Rome's enemy, but as an African civilization that challenged European power and nearly won. As a source of pride, of historical depth, of identity that predates colonialism, the Carthaginian legacy is taught in Tunisian schools. Archaeological research continues, often led by Tunisian scholars working to recover their own history from beneath Roman layers. This is how history resurfaces, slowly, through patient excavation, careful scholarship, and deliberate choice to remember what empires tried to make us forget. Carthage will never be fully recovered, too much was destroyed, too much knowledge lost. But what remains is enough to know that Rome's version of the story was propaganda, that the people they called barbarians built a civilization of sophistication and power, that the war they called inevitable was a choice, that the destruction they called necessary was genocide. Standing in the ruins of Carthage today, one can see across the Mediterranean towards Sicily, where the First War began, where a minor dispute over mercenaries ignited a century of conflict that reshaped the ancient world. From this vantage point, history feels less like inevitable progression and more like tragedy, a series of choices that led to catastrophe. What if Carthage and Rome had remained at peace? What if their spheres of influence had been maintained? The Mediterranean might have developed differently, a multipolar world of competing but coexisting civilizations, rather than the monolithic Roman Empire. Carthaginian commerce might have accelerated technological exchange between Africa, Europe, and Asia. Punic literature might have enriched global philosophical traditions. The blend of Phoenician, African, and Hellenistic cultures that Carthage represented might have flowered into something extraordinary. But empires rarely share, particularly when they're built on military conquest and territorial expansion. Rome's destiny, as they understood it, was dominion imperium sine fine, empire without end. Anything that limited that destiny had to be removed. Carthage's crime was not aggression, but existence. They occupied the space Rome wanted. They represented a path Rome rejected. They reminded Rome of its own near defeat. So Rome destroyed them and called it peace. Pax Romana, the peace of the graveyard. This pattern repeats throughout history because empires learn from each other. Rome taught later European powers how to frame conquest as civilization, how to justify erasure as progress. When Spanish conquistadors burned Aztec codices, they followed Roman precedent. When colonial authorities banned African languages and religions, they walked paths Rome cleared. When history books written by conquerors portrayed resistance as savagery, they echoed Roman historians describing Carthaginians. Understanding Carthage's destruction helps us recognize these patterns. It shows that what happened was not unique or inevitable, but strategic. A choice made by people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. Rome didn't stumble into destroying Carthage through the chaos of war. They debated it in the Senate, planned it methodically, and executed it systematically. The Third Punic War was not a conflict, but an execution following a predetermined sentence. And yet, empires fail. Rome, for all its power, eventually fell. Barbarian invasions, internal decay, administrative collapse, the eternal empire ended. The descendants of people Rome conquered or displaced eventually reclaimed their lands, their languages, their identities. History is longer than any empire. Carthage endures not as a city but as a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, of civilizations that refuse to be forgotten despite deliberate erasure, of the importance of questioning whose history we're taught and what stories are hidden in the silences. When you study ancient history, Carthage is usually a footnote to Rome's rise, the enemy that made Rome great, the rival whose defeat proved Roman superiority. But if you look closer, if you read archaeological reports and linguistic studies and reconstructions based on fragmentary evidence, a different story emerges. Of a sophisticated maritime civilization that pioneered navigation techniques still used today, of an economic system that sustained trans-Mediterranean trade networks for centuries, of military innovation that nearly toppled Rome, of cultural cosmopolitanism that blended traditions from 3 continents, of people who fought to the last breath to preserve their home, their identity, their right to exist. That story was nearly erased. But nearly not completely. Every time someone asks, what happened to Carthage, they resist that erasure. Every archaeological expedition uncovering Punic foundations adds to the record. Every scholar questioning Roman sources opens space for Carthaginian voices, however faint. Every student learns that history is contested, that victors' narratives can be challenged, that absence of evidence is sometimes evidence of suppression. They chip away at the silence Rome tried to impose. This is why we tell the story of Carthage's destruction, not just to chronicle ancient warfare, but to remember what was lost and why, to honor the resistance of a people who refused to surrender their city, even when defeat was certain. To acknowledge that history is written by victors but should not be limited to their perspective, to recognize that erasure is always political, always serves power, and always deserves to be questioned. The destruction of Carthage was not a tragedy in the Greek sense. There was no fatal flaw, no hubris punished by fate. It was a calculated act of imperial terrorism designed to eliminate a rival and terrorize potential resistors. Rome succeeded in destroying the city. They failed to destroy the memory, and in that failure lies hope, because if Carthage, systematically erased by the most powerful empire of its age, can still be remembered, studied, and honored, then no civilization is truly lost, no voice is permanently silenced, no history is beyond recovery. It requires work, dedication, and willingness to look beyond the official narrative, but it's possible. 3,000 years ago, Phoenician sailors founded a trading post on the North African coast. It grew into an empire. It challenged Rome. It burned, but the ashes still speak to those willing to listen, still teach those willing to learn, still remind us that history is not what powerful people say it is, but what all people struggle to preserve, remember, and pass forward. Delenda est Carthago, Cato said. Carthage must be destroyed. But here we are, discussing it, analyzing it, honoring it, learning from it. Rome destroyed the city. They couldn't destroy the story, and in the end, the story outlasts stone, outlasts empire, outlasts conquest. Carthage fell in 146 BCE, but it never truly died. It lives in every question about historical narrative, every effort to recover silenced voices, every recognition that victors' histories are incomplete. It lives in the ruins that tourists walk through, in the scholarship that reconstructs what was lost, in the Tunisian identity that claims this heritage as their own. And it lives here, in this telling, in your knowing, in the simple act of remembering that there was once a civilization called Carthage. That was great, that it was destroyed deliberately, that its destruction was not inevitable or just, but a choice, one choice among many that powerful people made in the ancient world. They chose erasure. We choose memory, and that makes all the difference.